Today I want to make a video in response to Sargon of Akkad, and I want to start off by saying that I actually really respect Sargon. I think that he makes a lot of great videos. He's a very intelligent, rational, logical person, very level-headed. He makes a lot of excellent points in his videos, and usually he's very good at pointing out logical inconsistencies in the arguments of the people that he's essentially bringing down. And I really respect his viewpoints on many things. The video in particular that I want to make a response about is called #Brexit, #ProjectFear. It's ridiculous. And I want to make a video in response to this, partly because I disagree with it so strongly, and also because I think of Sargon's videos, it is probably one of his weaker videos that I've watched, at least. And this is likely due to, in his own admissions, he's not an expert on the EU referendum. I don't claim to be an expert on the EU referendum, but I have dedicated a lot of time thinking about it and looking into certain aspects. So perhaps, I would consider myself better informed than a lot of people, at least. So without further ado, I'll just dive in. So one of the things that Sargon says about the EU referendum is that he finds it quite confusing because there's a lot of conflicting points on both sides of the argument, and he isn't really sure who to believe. And I do sympathise with this because, there is a lot of essentially misinformation and a lot of hysteria about it. Harriet Harman for the Remain side saying that if the UK leaves the EU, then it will make Britain a more sexist place. Clearly, that's not helping anyone, because I personally, I find that unsubstantiated bullshit, and I would object to that as strongly as I object to the bullshit that comes from the Leave campaign. But it really does kind of strike me as strange how Sargon considers that actually it is the Remain campaign that seems to be spewing the most bullshit. And I completely accept that I'm not an impartial judge in this. I'm very strongly in the Remain campaign, but just to give an example of the bullshit that the Leave campaign spew, I think actually the Leave campaign is incredibly dishonest in its campaign. They're not only actively lying about the EU, they also perpetuate falsehoods and misinformation about the EU. So, for example, the EU, the Leave campaign consistently, and it's it's essentially a corner piece of their campaign. They say that we spend £350 million a week on the EU for membership fees. And I'm not denying that A, that's a lot of money, and B, that is the figure, because that is the figure. But at the same time, the UK also gets a rebate from the EU, and we also get money back from the EU through the Common Agricultural Programme and also the EU Development Fund, amongst other things. So the actual figure that we actually spend on the EU every week is closer to £175 million pounds a week. Again, it's still a lot of money, but it's a lot less than £350 million a week. And the reason why the Leave campaign don't want to use that, even though they know it, and this isn't some kind of eye in the sky figure. This is actually it's a workable figure that you can kind of work out by taking the money that we get back from the rebate, the money from the Common Agricultural Policy, and the money that we get back from the EU Development Fund. It's a concrete figure that you can work out. It's not disputed by anyone, except the Leave campaign don't want to use it because it doesn't sound as terrifying, doesn't sound as impressive as £350 million a week. And for them to know that there is an alternative figure that is actually more accurate because it takes into account money we get back, it's just completely dishonest. Now, I would actually say it's lying to the public because they know that most people are just going to take that at face value, even though it's not an accurate figure. So I would actually say it's just completely, like, it's complete and utter BS, and it's lies. But, I mean, I don't understand why Sargon hasn't picked up on that, because these aren't, these aren't figures that are hidden anywhere. This is just, scratching at the surface, to be honest. And for Sargon to not call out the Leave campaign on this is, frankly staggering, to be honest. Now, I can give you another example of the Leave campaign's rubbish. For example, this whole notion that the UK doesn't make its laws, and in fact it is the EU, and not just the EU, but the EU Commission, which is unelected. I'll concede that it is unelected, but then there's the claim that it's the EU Commission that are passing our laws, and this again is complete misinformation. It is true that the EU Commission, as I've said and concede, it is unelected, but they basically dream up the wording of the law. It gets looked at in either the European Parliament or in the EU Council, which is made up by the 28 member states, minister from the 28 member states, which are all democratically elected, I must add, and then they decide any amendments to make on that, and then pass the laws if they all agree to it. So it is a democratic process, and it's not even as though that relates to every single aspect of UK law. If it did relate to every aspect of UK law, what the hell would be the point of, for example, the Queen's speech that we've had in the last week? So for the Leave campaign to actually say that we don't make our own laws and they're all passed by unelected bureaucrats in Europe, it's just complete misinformation, and it really doesn't help the debate when actually they're just lying, because most people are just going to accept this at face value, and that is a big, I find it incredibly problematic that they're saying all these essentially lies, and we have, people aren't calling them up on it, and I've got to say, Sargon, it disappoints me that you haven't called them up on it either. To address your point of scaremongering from the Remain campaign, I find it, again, problematic that you can call it scaremongering, especially, I suppose, you're talking about the economy. I find it problematic that you can call it scaremongering when it's not just our government, so David Cameron and the Remain campaign. It is independent and respected financial institutions that are actually coming up with these forecasts. So even if you want to accept, and I don't, that the Treasury and the Bank of England have had pressure from the government in order to release these reports, then that doesn't account for every other financial institution, such as the IMF or the OECD, both all saying that leaving the EU would be harmful to the UK economy. And it doesn't account for other governments and allies saying we think that you as our ally would be weaker from after leaving the EU. And to say that actually all those fairly respected organisations are wrong, and actually it is the Leave campaign that have got it right, especially when the Leave campaign have failed to provide any kind of economic alternative, or at least models, in opposition. It's just batshit crazy. And how can you not call them up on it? I just don't understand how you could not. Their thinking, to me, is so kind of pie in the sky that it doesn't even kind of like warrant an argument, but I'm more than happy to go into it, and I'll try to keep it brief. So 44% of our exports currently go to Europe. Of our exports, the largest sector by far is financial services, which account for 39% of our exports. Another 13% of our exports are in insurance. So overall, 51% of our exports are essentially financial related. Of financial services, 40% go to the EU. In fact, it's 42%. And another 20% of insurance exports go to the EU. And in total, I think this works out to be something, I think it's quite a considerable amount. Bear with me. So something like 20%, not 20%, 20 billion of our exports go to the EU in just that sector. Now, our other exports include gems and precious metals, cars, machinery, pharmaceuticals, and oil. And of all those things, we're not going to, start massively increasing the production of cars. In fact, it's likely to be quite the opposite, as car companies like Nissan, for example, relocate onto the continent. Or at least reconsider their investment in the UK. We're not going to suddenly start mining more gold or precious metals or gems. Our pharmaceutical companies are not going to, start expanding massively to fill that gap. So it stands to reason that if our trade with Europe is affected, then firstly that's going to, cause our economy to, at least wobble, if not, go down the toilet. And this could be exacerbated by what happens in Europe, in the EU specifically. And I say this because as 44% of our trade, or our exports at least, Europe essentially becomes a millstone around our neck. And if Europe sinks, which it may well do if it implodes, again, this is worst case scenario, but I'm sure you will forgive me, Sargon, if I subscribe to the plan, hope for the best and plan for the worst kind of mantra. If the EU does implode and this causes a lot of problems amongst our trade partners, it's going to have a knock-on effect to us as well. And that's why I describe the EU as a potential millstone around our neck. I also would say that if we leave, this trade relationship is not going to be kind of dismantled overnight, but that makes it even more risky, because while we could negotiate with other trade partners, how long is that going to take? What terms are it going to be on? And in the meantime, if we still can't sell our goods to Europe or our financial services to Europe, then that is a big problem for our economy. So I don't think it's outlandish what those financial institutions are saying, and I don't think it's scaremongering. I think it is a relatively well balanced, or at least relatively well informed projection of what consequences of leaving the EU could be. I want to say that I'm not an economist. I am a classicist, so I couldn't tell you much about the economy, but I mean, I think I'm intelligent enough to know that we're not just going to replace that trade overnight, and if we can't sell to the EU, then that is going to be a huge problem for us. And to kind of to clarify, if it needs to be clarified, why I think it will be a problem if our financial services are so kind of affected by us leaving the EU, it's because we rely on basically being part of the single market and passporting our services to other EU countries as a result of that. So if we leave the single market, which is something that the Leave campaign want to do, then it will have a big effect on our financial services sector. And I deeply suspect that a lot of the banks will relocate to Paris or Frankfurt as a result of that, costing us even more jobs and money. So I mean, I'm more than happy to kind of go into this in a kind of private discussion or through other means, Sargon. But I mean, this is how I see it, and so I don't agree that it's scaremongering. I think it's just advice, and even if it's advice that we don't want to hear, it doesn't make it scaremongering. Uh, Again, I'm not a classist. I'm not an economist. I'm a classicist. But I mean, you kind of said it at the beginning of your video as well, in that when the polls showed a 15-point lead for remaining in, the pound strengthened. Now that to me says that other outward investors into pound sterling see remaining in as a good thing. They have more confidence in the UK economy. They think that the UK economy will be more stable in the EU, and it will also be more certain. Now, say what you want about confidence, but certainly an example of confidence having, or a lack of confidence, I should say, in a market and in an economy having particularly terrible consequences is, I believe, the Wall Street crash, where there was a complete lack of confidence in the market, and basically everyone flogged their stocks. So this led to runs on Wall Street, and stocks collapsed, the economy collapsed, and we were in the Great Depression. So I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm just using that as a counterpoint to say that having a lack of confidence in the market isn't, that's not an ideal situation economically, or at least from a historian's point of view. Now, as we're kind of talking about America and Wall Street, one of the points that you made is that Obama threatened us. Now, there's actually a really great scene in season 2 of Game of Thrones, with no spoilers. I'm just going to say Tyrion points out to Tyrant King Joffrey the difference between a threat and a warning. What Obama said to us is not a threat, it's a warning, really. If Britain leaves the EU, it will be at the back of the queue to negotiate a new deal. What Obama was saying is not a threat, it's saying, well, if you want to come and negotiate with us as a new country, you'll have to come to the back of the queue, and we're not going to give you any special treatment. That's not a threat in any way. That's just, we're going to treat everyone fairly. You came to us last, so we'll deal with you last. If it piques our national arrogance, then I'm sorry. And if you consider it a threat because we're not getting special treatment, again, I'm sorry, but I disagree that it is a threat. It's merely him stating that Britain are just going to be the last ones they get to in terms of the queue. I just want to also draw a link between another thing that you said in your video about the French, I think it's French finance minister, Macron, saying that if the UK does leave the EU, then the banks in Paris will be rolling out the red carpet. Now, I've already hinted that a lot of the banks will withdraw their banks from the EU, from the UK, in order to relocate onto the continent into the single market if the UK does leave the single market. So basically what Macron was saying there is that basically Paris should want to attract these banks to Paris rather than, for example, the likely alternative, which will be Frankfurt, so they can benefit and strengthen their own financial services sector. I'm pretty sure I don't need to elaborate as to why that would be desirable for them. And I think I was quite clear in why the banks would want to relocate back into the single market. So I'll just leave it at that. Again, the German finance minister, you said that he said that trade deals can take years to negotiate, and if you consider that fear mongering, I'll leave that to you. But trade deals can take years to negotiate. Quite famously, the Canada EU free trade agreement took 8 years to negotiate and still hasn't actually been ratified because certain member countries in the EU, I believe it's Hungary and Romania, take exception to not being allowed visa-free travel to Canada. So they haven't, their parliaments haven't signed it, and so that treaty hasn't actually come into force yet. So it's not a lie to say that that free trade deals can take years to negotiate, and it's not fear mongering. It's simply a statement of fact. Certainly, the UK could negotiate a much quicker trade deal with the EU. It could take no time at all. It could negotiate a trade deal with China in the matter of a day, if, for example, all it took was for China to name their desires and their wishes, and we would have to essentially bend over backwards to accommodate them. If we actually wanted a trade deal that also suited our own interests beyond access to certain aspects of their market in, for example, 15 years' time, which is apparently quite similar to a deal that Switzerland has done with China, then that deal could potentially take quite a lot longer to negotiate. And you might point out that we're Britain, we're the 5th largest economy in the world, but then you also have to take into account that we're a market of 60 million people with very few exports that people actually want. So, I mean, I'll leave you to decide what kind of position we would be in to negotiate trade deals, but my opinion is that it's not a strong position. In your video, you go on to Merkel, saying that she's being more fair. Now, I want to point out that Angela Merkel, as wonderful as she may or may not be, is the Chancellor of Germany. She doesn't get to decide what the EU does. All 28 members of the EU have to agree. And Merkel, as the Chancellor of Germany, she might not even be in power when the time comes to actually negotiate this. I mean, Germany is democracy. I don't know when the next German elections are, but then at the same time, we don't know how long these negotiations are going to take. So by the time it actually gets around to it, perhaps there'll be a change of leadership in Germany. There's someone who's less conciliatory towards the UK leaving. But it kind of goes back to the trade deals and how long they take. No one is saying that we won't really be able to trade. The question is, what will the terms be? Because we all know that we can negotiate a trade deal, but it'll be, what are the terms going to be? We know that we'll be able to negotiate a trade deal with the EU, but what will the terms be? That is the uncertainty that that people are quite rightly questioning. So if we do a trade deal with the EU, will we, for example, want to sacrifice our financial services sector so that we don't have to accept freedom of movement, if that's even an option? These are the kind of issues that we have, and I personally don't think that the UK is going to be in a strong position to be able to dictate terms to the EU. But that's a personal opinion. It's shared by a lot of people, and a lot of very sensible, well-informed people especially, and not demagogues who are basically saying, stop immigration, they took our jobs, and overburdening regulation, whatever the fuck that means. Another point to make about Merkel, you say that she is toning down punishing the UK if the UK does in fact decide to leave. I want to just make the point that toning down is not stopping, it is just reducing. So implicit in that is that there will still be punitive measures taken, Now, it might be the case that all punitive measures that people want to put in force are stopped. I'm not saying that's not a possibility, but how do we guarantee this? There are 28 member states in the EU, which I would concede is one of the problems of the EU, in that it takes a lot of time to negotiate things, potentially to get an agreement, to get consensus. So, I mean, overall, how are you going to guarantee that at least one of those 28 member states, or at least, or the majority of those 28 member states, are not going to want to punish us, or are going to accept restrictions on punishing us when we leave? You just can't. You can't guarantee that they are going to want to punish us as well, but I mean, it just adds to the uncertainty of what is actually going to happen if we do leave the EU. And as I've mentioned many times, that's far from certain, especially because the Leave campaign just flat out refused to provide a realistic, or at least kind of reasoned argument as to what it will be like based on X, Y, and Z. To go back to a kind of point I made about the EU being made up of 28 member states, we are one of those 28 member states. So the EU doesn't rule us in the same way that London doesn't rule Scotland. How it works is that we are a member country and we all agree on laws and on policies to take, the direction the EU should be going in. It's exactly in the same way that the UK as a whole elects members of Parliament to Parliament and governs the country. We also elect MEPs, although I couldn't even tell you who my MEP is despite this EU referendum. It's simply not true that the EU rules us. We have a hand in the EU, and we're quite a strong hand as well as one of the major economies and a net contributor to the EU budget. We have a very powerful influence in the EU, and my opinion is if we were to only embrace our role in the EU rather than standing on the sidelines calling everyone a foreign cunt who is a lazy layabout and just scrounges on benefits and wants to come to the UK. If we only kind of stop that kind of attitude, then actually we would probably have a lot more influence in the EU, because let's face it, no one likes being called all of those things. And if we actually treated them like partners rather than adversaries and tried to strong arm them into doing what we want, I think we could get away even more than we already do, which is apparently quite considerable. So one thing that I wanted to that I said that I would come back to at the end of the video, I believe is about the kind of the outlandish claim that Cameron made that leaving the EU could lead to war. Now, I don't agree with that on face value. I think it's a very kind of simplistic viewpoint to take. But the actual overall idea of it, which what I understood from that, and actually have said a couple of times to my friends and family, is that if the if the UK does leave the EU and the EU does then implode, for example, if Greece also decides that it's better off outside the EU, and therefore if, for example, Italy and Spain decide that it'd be better to leave the EU, then what we have left is potentially a very fractured and divided Europe, or at least fractured Europe. Now, I'm not suggesting that overnight the EU is just going to implode, or it's just going to stop cooperating. But I think without a strong EU, Russia in particular will kind of see that as a kind of a sign of weakness, and we can rely on NATO and I'm not saying that it's the EU that's keeping us safe. The EU is a major component in that, but also the overall framework is NATO. I'm not going to say that's not the case, but I deeply suspect that Russia will try to nibble away at the edges and try and re-establish the influence that they once had, especially across the Baltic states and in the Caucasus. So I don't think Cameron is right at kind of face value when he says that leaving the EU will lead to war, but I think what he probably meant was that if we leave the EU, then essentially it will give Russia opportunity to nibble away at the edges of Europe, like it has done in Crimea and in East Ukraine. I think that's quite a realistic proposition, and I just want to draw your attention to kind of parallels between classical and Hellenistic Greece and their relationship with Rome. Rome, by the end of the 3rd century BC, had won pretty much the Second Punic Wars and was a huge power. Greece at the time was very fragmented and divided. It had a couple of leagues, and the Romans were very able to exploit these divisions in between the leagues. So the Achaean League and the Aetolian leagues end up essentially just being brushed aside as Rome completely absorbed Greece over the next essentially half century, culminating in the sack of Corinth in 146 BC. I'm not saying that the situations are identical, but I do believe that if we're divided, which I think is likely to be the case if the UK does leave the EU, then it gives Russia an opportunity to drive wedges between us and destabilise Europe and, like I said, nibble around at the edges. The last point I wanted to make in response to your video is your kind of you'd rather live in a poor democracy versus a wealthy oligarchy. I don't disagree with that kind of that statement necessarily, but I would really question what you think the UK is and whose interest do you think politicians in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, whose interest do you really think they serve? Because I don't believe they particularly listen to what the people want. They are elected for 5 years and they do what the fuck they like, is my opinion. It'd be interesting to see what you think they do and what they are. So, Sargon, I hope at least, I don't expect to have changed your mind. And, I hope that you do respond to this video, or at least, even if it's just a private message, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. And I hope this video gives you food for thought, which is, I suppose, probably the main aim for this, because as you can see, this video is probably it is definitely quite amateurish by your standards. I've made it, in pretty much of a hurry. I will include kind of links at the bottom, but when you have so much more influence over people than I do, you have a lot more subscribers, a lot more people listen to you. I really think that actually when you kind of produce such a kind of a video where I suppose I would say that you're less informed than you usually are, I think that is potentially quite harmful. So I hope you kind of take the time to kind of at least put some more research into it, and I hope that this video prompts you.